So great. So I think we've got a good mix of folks who've been on for a long time, folks who are fairly new, folks who've been on kind of a middle range. So it'll be great to get a sense from you, one, how helpful this is, and two, to make sure that everybody understands what you can be doing with GoSmart. So as it was billed, what we're going to talk about today is just completing your grant opportunity. And I sort of conflate some terminology. When I say grant opportunity, I'm really talking about your whole workflow and not just your grant application. So, so that opportunity might include an application plus a subcycle or a flex page set or an interim report and or a final report. So we're going to chat about all those pieces today. And you're going to hear me really say all those words a bunch of times. So to that point, let's talk about kind of what I just said, how it's really easy to sort of conflate a lot of the same terminology to mean different things or different terminology to mean the same things. So I know everybody's here using the software because you have an application and presumably you have an application process. But I know that we've taken to using the word application to mean the whole enchilada. But application really in your process is but one form, right, that you have your applicants fill out. Now maybe your process does just include an application and then it's so simple there's really no other piece. But by and large, I think most of us use other items that you see listed here. So again, things like an intent to apply, which of course would come before the application. And then things that come just after the application might include a subcycle, a flexible cycle, an interim report, or a final report. So when we start talking about building your application in GoSmart, I think sometimes people can sort of feel like, oh, I've built my application form, where I'm really asking the questions, really getting to know what my grantee is offering, and then there's nothing else. But GoSmart offers the ability to have all of these additional forms that we just talked about. So we just want to make sure that you know how to use those within the same application cycle and then in tandem with an existing application cycle. So again, just to really hammer home that there are some different pieces to actually finalize that grant opportunity, that application cycle. And that would be, those 4 items. And the reason that we want you to be able to know that you can do that in GoSmart versus using, a survey or even just emailing back and forth is that you really can retain all of your data in one place if you follow some of the steps we talk about today. So it's better for your data retention. It's better for reporting. At the end of your whole grant opportunity, you're able to just pull all of that data in 1 or maybe 2 or 3 reports, depending on how you build. And then, of course, it's just easier for your applicant if they know that they can keep going back to the same space or a similar space to finish out those additional items. So we've really talked about those 4 main items that sort of finalize an application cycle, a grant opportunity. And the first of those is a subcycle. And this is really best used when you want to make a form available after the initial application is submitted. So I know some of our folks do maybe kind of an entree, and it's more intense than an intent to apply. So you have, a full application form, and then maybe internally you and your admin go through and sort of sift out who are appropriate applicants, and then they go on to fill out even another kind of robust application before the paneling begins. That might be a good use of a subcycle. And there's a way from the program cycle editor to create a subcycle off of the initial application. And I won't get into too much detail how to actually do those pieces. If that seems like something that's going to be valuable for you, we have tutorials, and I would happily have a more detailed conversation. But again, this is just to get you to know what's available to you in GoSmart. So once you build that subcycle from the program cycle editor, you can make it available to a smaller portion of the initial applicant pool who have moved forward together. And the other great thing about a subcycle is that it includes a portion, or can include a portion, of the original application. So let's say you've asked a whole host of questions that are important for the panelists, but they were important for your initial internal admin review, maybe you want to make that page available to the panelists as well, and you don't want to ask those questions again of the applicant. You can include that page or multiple pages in this sub-cycle and then add on additional pages that might be more appropriate. It also, in case it wasn't clear, this might be a secondary or even tertiary application form. And what that's going to look like to applicants is it's going to create a new form in a separate bounded box with a different name, and we'll see that on the next slide. But some rules to think about is that you might want to go the sub-cycle route because it can be submitted multiple times. It will retain the same application number if only one application and one sub-cycle are submitted. If multiple of either of those are submitted, then the system has to start creating new numbers. But it's nice if you need to retain that application number from initial application to secondary or tertiary application. Now, sub-cycles cannot have interim or final reports, so you'd have to go back to the initial application to build on an interim or final report. And it'll use its own unique statuses, so its own status workflow. So if you build a sub-cycle, you'll have to go to a separate grant manager dashboard for the sub-cycle, and you'll review statuses there like in progress or received, versus something like an interim report that would just continue on the status workflow from the application. And again, a lot of this might be sort of hard to be picturing right now, but we'll see it as we move forward. So again, a sub-cycle to your applicant, and here we're looking at the applicant's current programs and applications page. They would see the initial application, maybe Community Support 18, and then when you go in and you build your sub-cycle, they'll come back and they'll see a new bounded box with the name of that sub-cycle. Now, in my example here, the sub-cycle was for the purpose of an invoice, but again, to my example, maybe it's just a secondary application form. And you can make this whatever you want it to be. I always recommend including the same prefix here and then adding on whatever the item is. So maybe it's Community Support 2018 secondary application. Oh, and another thing to consider is that sub-cycles are only visible to applicants who've been moved forward together. So there's no need to hide this from applicants who shouldn't have access, and just know that it's only available. So it would make more sense to an applicant who filled out this form and moved forward to come back and see something like Community Support 2018 secondary application, or second piece, or 2.0, whatever you call it. But it is going to be two separate bounded boxes. And then from the back end, as I said, you're going to come in, you're going to make your sub-cycle, and then you'll see all of your existing forms from that application, and you'll have this ability to hide or display the page. So as I said, maybe this is these are important pages for your panelists to see, so you don't want to ask those questions again. So you can keep those pages displayed in the sub-cycle, and then maybe you want to hide a page that shouldn't be visible to panelists, and you would hide those pages there. You can also always come in and modify any existing pages. So maybe you want to display this page, but you want to hide or remove a question about demographics, for instance. All right, so that is what the sub-cycle looks like. Again, I did mention when you're looking at your grant manager dashboard, because you build a sub-cycle, you would need to select one or the other when you're actually looking at applicants' progress, when you're trying to make a report. Those are treated as two separate cycles in the system, even though there is sort of a connection. And that connection is always going to be visible via these two dashes. So if you had changed the name of this drastically, you would still know that this sub-cycle, which you're going to manage as a separate cycle, belongs to this initial cycle. But this is also why I always recommend sort of keeping the naming convention the same and then just adding your own appropriate appendage there. All right, so that's a sub-cycle. I don't see those used as frequently, mainly because the system, to work as dynamically as it does, 100% of the applicants have to move forward at the same time. So you go through your first application form, you decide these 20 people move forward to the secondary form. You have to make that choice at a snapshot in time, one time only, and then move them forward to this sub-cycle. And I know that trips people up a lot because then you're never able to sort of let someone in after the fact. So if you have somebody come in and say, oh, you know, I forgot an answer, and I think it would have made a difference, and you would have let me into that second session, then you sort of have to start from scratch. So it's a really great way to use the system, but you have to be sort of confident that it's ready to go all at one time. So what we've been recommending instead of that, if you feel like you need to be a little bit more flexible with who gets into this secondary item, if you also need to be more flexible about what that secondary item looks like, maybe it doesn't look anything like a secondary application, maybe it is more like an invoice or a reimbursement form, then we're recommending this flexible page set. So the best uses for this are when you need to create a form that should be available after the initial application is submitted and typically approved, and if it should also be open to a smaller portion of the initial applicant pool, but they don't have to move forward immediately together, but they can be. And then, again, for something maybe like a reimbursement form or an invoice, a kind of form that you need to be creating and making available to applicants and then receiving from them throughout that grantee period is when a flexible page set is the best. Now, this sounds a little bit like an interim report for some of you. Maybe your interim report is a very basic form that just says, you know, hey, check in with us 3 months or 6 months after you've been funded. This differs from that a little bit in a couple ways that we'll talk about below. So this differs from an interim report in the appearance that it has to applicants. Again, a flexible page set is going to create a new form in a separate bounded box, kind of like what we saw with the subcycle, whereas an interim report is going to be built right into that application form bounded box, and again, we'll see that example too. But then rules that differ for the flexible page set is that it behaves like any other application form. It can be submitted multiple times, so it's really great for reimbursement or an invoice if you need them to get those to you more than once throughout the grantee period. It can have a unique work sample select page, which is also sometimes an issue for some folks. As you know, you can only have one work sample select page per cycle. This gives you the opportunity to create basically a new cycle and then include that work sample page if you need to be asking for robust media throughout that grantee period. It can have its own interim or final report. I still recommend going back to the initial application to build in an interim or a final report, but sometimes, depending on where you're using that flexible page set for, it might make sense to build an interim report or final report there. And then it will use its own unique status, again, separate from the initial application. So you're going to see it as a separate cycle on your Grant Manager dashboard, and it's going to use its own workflow of statuses. So it will say in progress or received versus interim report received or final report received. So again, we're seeing basically the same thing we saw on the sub-cycle, where we've got our initial application is in one bounded box, and then our flex cycle is in another bounded box. The difference here, and I'm sorry I forgot to point it out, was that here you'll see that we're getting unique application numbers. And it just so happens these are sort of transposed. That's not always going to be the case. But this would have its own application number, and then when folks come in here to fill out their flex cycle, they're going to get assigned a whole new unrelated application number. Now, that's not always very important. I think a lot of people used to assume that the application number was sort of the most important way to tie things together. But when you go to build reports, let's say for each of these cycles, it's just as easy to pull that data together by a username or a user email address or even just a contact name. So the application number really doesn't stay as important as it might have been in the past. So it's really, it should be different from you using a flexible cycle. And then again, what it's going to look like to you on the back end is as though you're building a whole new application form. So there's no connection to the initial application like there was with a sub-cycle. You're just coming in, you're building a new cycle, you're giving it a new name, but again, preferably something with the same prefix and then a different appendage. And then you're going to build those pages just like you would for the application, but these, of course, are going to be questions that you're asking during the granting period. All right, then we've got our interim report. And this is a lot more common, I think, just industry-wide. Most of you probably do some kind of midstream reporting if your grantee period is pretty long. you want your folks to check in maybe mid-year. And so the best uses of that is, just as it sounds, mid-funding reporting. Or likewise, you could be using this to ask for uploaded attachments that may be available outside of the system. I just spoke with a client last week who emails her folks a contract and an award after they do the paneling. And then this gave her a really good opportunity to say, send it back to us via GoSmart, the interim report, and attach that contract, signed contract through your interim report so that we have it all in one space. Now you can of course ask for uploads in a flex cycle or a sub-cycle as well, but what I'm going to show you on the next page is how the interim report builds right into the application cycle, and sometimes I would recommend that over building a flex cycle if you can help it. So some rules that have to apply to the interim report pages are that they are, as I said, created within the same cycle, and we'll show you from the back end what that looks like. They can only be accessed and submitted once, which might be a reason why you would choose a flexible cycle over an interim report. Now, when I say they can only be submitted once, that's per the rules of the system. You can always manually go back in and change the status. So if I'm an applicant and I submit an interim report, my status for that whole application cycle now says interim report received, and technically that interim report becomes read-only to me. Technically, or typically, you as the admin would go in and approve that interim report and change their status to interim report approved. But if you wanted them to submit the interim report more than once, based on the way that we build it, you could always set their status back to funded instead, and it's kind of like setting their application back to in progress. It makes it modifiable again, and they're able to add to it or submit it anew. So there's some pros and cons to that, and if that seems like something you want to do moving forward, let's chat about that. But it's a good idea if you're doing something really basic, like maybe you've created an invoice form outside of the system, so maybe it's like a PDF or an Excel spreadsheet that they download, fill out, and upload. If you're doing something super basic like that, I might still recommend an interim report over a flex cycle, and that you just manually open the interim report every time it's due. So maybe it's due quarterly. You'd come back in and change those folks to funded from interim report received so that they can keep getting back in and then maybe reattaching every quarter this report that you've made outside of the system. So obviously a bunch of ways to use it, but let's just chat if any of these seem like they're swaying from the norm a little bit. And then, as is clear from a lot of the things I just said, the rules of the interim report are that it will use statuses that continue the workflow. So this, an interim report will never be in progress or received. It will be funded if it's possibly in progress, and then interim report received once they submit, interim report approved once you approve it, and so on. So again, what I really like about using an interim report versus a flex cycle is that the interim report is housed in this same bounding box. So it makes sense to tell your applicants, in 3 months or 6 months or whenever they're supposed to come back for the interim report, come back to the initial cycle, look for the interim report, and begin that form there, versus looking here for a new item. Now, both are totally doable. It's just a matter of directing folks the right way. But I always want to err on the side of sort of keeping it as one item. It also makes it one step easier when you go to report, because I can report on the application data and the interim report data and the final report data, if there is one, all in one shot. Whereas here, I'm going to build a report for this guy, I'm going to build a report for this guy, and then cull them together, which isn't at all a challenge to do, but it is that extra step. And then again, on the back end, what you'll see when you're building an interim report or a final report is that you build those pages right into the same cycle. So rather than building a new cycle, whether it's a flex cycle or sub-cycle, you're still going back to that same initial cycle, and then you're adding on an interim report page or a final report page. And you do that on this same page by down below, when you're adding pages, you just check that box that says interim report page or final report page, and then the system knows what to do with it. Another great thing about using the same cycle is that you can link certain pages. So if you're using a budget form or template, you can link them to the initial application or the interim report, and all that data is already pre-filled, and your applicant can just overwrite it. So in a lot of ways, this is why it's really the most, the best way to do it, because it saves you and your applicants, can save you and your applicants a lot of time. And then again, just to show you from the Grant Manager dashboard, we're looking at the same workflow. So applicants who submit their application and go from in progress to probably received to funded, now will go right to interim report received, rather than you having to look at a separate cycle and going back to that sort of the in progress step. And then finally, we've got our final reports, which are going to work very similarly to your interim reports. Again, the best uses are, pretty standard. It's just post-funding reporting. It's the last time you talk to your applicant about their grant funds. And again, the appearance to the applicant is that it's housed within that same bounding box. And then the rules are that the final report pages are, again, created within that same cycle. They can only be accessed and submitted once unless you manually go back in and change it to funded or interim report approved, and then they can keep getting back into it. But with a final report, I'd recommend that even less, because really the idea of final report is that this is a one-time, last time we hear from our applicant. And again, it's going to use those statuses that continue the workflow with something like final report received or final report exception. So one last time you'll see it's just all in the same bounded box, and I like that. It keeps it clean. The applicant knows where to come back to. They'll work on their final report. They'll see the dates and deadlines for the whole cycle, and then know exactly where they're coming to for the whole application process. So that is the basic 4 ways that I would recommend that you use the system to complete your application process. Now, there is one final sort of caveat, and that is for folks to report to the NEA. And again, you're still going to use the system the same way, but you definitely want to keep it as one single cycle. So rather than using things like the flex page or the sub-cycle, you're going to build your application form. You're going to include in the application that NEA template, and then you're going to make a final report and be sure to include, again, the NEA template, a locations template, and a project budget. Now, if you don't report to the NEA, this might not mean much to you. And if you do report to the NEA and you have questions, for sure let me know if it's not clear what we're saying here. But you want to just make sure that you're using all the tools of the system to make it really easy. If you follow this path for your NEA cycles, then all you have to do at the end of the cycle is go to our reports page, click NEA report, and then you're ready to go. You don't have to pull information together that the NEA or NASA are asking for. So it makes it really tidy. All right, so our best practices here. First off, like anything, make a plan. So while most of the post-application forms don't need to be created until the weeks before they're available to the applicants, it's always best to consider the full grant opportunity, the full application cycle workflow before you even make the application available, so that you can really be set up for success. So by that I mean you may make the application January 1. You might not need a final report until December 31st or maybe January 1 the following year. No problem. You can totally make that final report next fall. But you want to just have a sense of, how am I going to be doing that? Am I going to use a final report in the same cycle? Am I going to create a flexible cycle because I'm doing something unusual and I need to be able to ask for it a couple times? Just have a sense of that beforehand so that we know the best way to build the application as well. And always ask questions. So we're always happy to discuss the best way you should administer your grant opportunity. We're your best resource when you're considering your workflow. So again, almost all of you have been in the system at least one cycle, or maybe you are just starting your new cycle. Make sure to have a conversation with us about what that whole cycle looks like. Including things that you might not have considered for GoSmart, like your invoices or your reimbursement forms, or even your contract letters. The system does not create contracts and awards, but we have really great ways to help you create those letters and then again keep them as part of the sort of repository if you ask for your applicants to upload those through the GoSmart system. So we always have a great great ideas to help you. So be sure to include us in that planning. And then just lastly, don't be afraid of change. So we're built with simplicity in mind. Sometimes that may mean you want to modify your old workflow to ensure that you're asking only for what you need. Or sometimes you want to modify that because it just makes the most sense for the system. And I know that there's always this fear that, oh, that's putting a burden on the applicant or maybe on your panelists. And we have definitely set up the system to make sure that we're making it the easiest for your folks as possible. So let us help you there as well. And then, of course, just join in things like today so that you always understand what you can do with GoSmart. Alrighty. Like always, I love to give you just a ton of information and then imagine that you can come up with questions right away. But does anybody have any questions right off the bat? Super. All right. As always, this is going to be available on the website, and there's always sort of companion tutorials that help you use all of those items, like a subcycle or a flex page or an interim or final report. And then I'm, of course, always available at jessica.bronick@weststaff.org. So do check out those resources. And, yeah, just be sure to use us when you're thinking about your whole application process. Thanks so much for joining today. Take care, everyone.